And good afternoon and welcome to Manure Monday, where we like to talk about all things manure with people everywhere. So welcome back. And boy, we had a great time last week. Super discussion. In fact, I do want to share something from last week that was kind of interesting. Let me pull this up here. And just to get things going in the chat here, boy, take a look at that and give an answer to that question. So we're looking at this tank in front of us here, 14 feet deep, 160 feet wide. It is dairy manure. And so I'd like you to put your answer in the chat. How much do you think that this manure is worth? If you were to put a value on the NPK, okay, based on last year's numbers, what's your guess? What is the value of the manure in that tank worth? So put that in the chat. And yeah, just boy, we had a great discussion last week. If you were part of that, we were here 2 hours and lots of great questions, comments, feedback. And I think we could have kept going, but 2 hours was enough. So great chat, and reminder that all these sessions are recorded. And so you can look them up again, go to Field Crop News and take a look at them. So that would be a great one to look at. And that would give you the answer to this question here. And there it is right there. About $130,000 in Canadian dollars. What's that? That's like, what, 10 bucks American or something? But 130,000 Canadian dollars NPK equivalent. Here's one more that Christine Brown has thrown in just for interest's sake. This one is solid manure. It is turkey and 930 tones. Okay, again, put in the chat, what do you think the value of that would be in terms of NP and K? And just give you a quick second to think on that. So as we're going today, our topic is going to be managing weed seeds in manure. And this was a session that Chris Brown had heard down in Pennsylvania last year at the Manure Expo, and thought, wow, this is good for a broader audience. Let's bring this topic here to our Manure Mondays. So we are going to have 3 folks on our panel today who will talk about that. Reminder, we ask you to stay muted. We do love if you post questions in the chat, and we will have a QR code at the end if you're a certified crop advisor. So here's the answer. Turkey manure, $101,000 Canadian. So boy, it's just a reminder that manure is a valuable product. You know, we're not talking about a waste product anymore. We're talking about something valuable. So I'm looking at the chat here, some numbers, and it seems like we're all a little bit low. But lots of good numbers there. So introducing our panel today, you can see them here in front of you. So first, Chrissy Moderman, and Chrissy is she is with the University of Minnesota. She's an extension educator and focuses her work on manure nutrient management education. So Chrissy's, we're thrilled to have you here today. And along with her, we have Dr. Steph, is what she likes to go by, and it's Stephanie Caleza, and she really is in the crops and soils department. Done a lot of work around poultry, and she's a specialist in that department. So we're gonna hear from the 2 of them. Each are going to give a presentation, and then joining them as well is my colleague Mike Cobra from Ontario with OMAFRA, and he is a weed management specialist. And we brought Mike in, just giving him fair game to ask some questions, generate some discussion, as we have at the end a time for this panel just to shoot the breeze. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining us. Chrissy's, I'll let you go ahead and share your screen and start it off, and then we'll follow right after with Dr. Steph. All right, all yours, Chrissy's.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Okay, I think I've got it set up here. Let me adjust this bar. And we can be off. Yeah, like Andrew said, my name is Chrissy Moderman. I'm an extension educator with the University of Minnesota. I kind of live on the west central area of Minnesota, kind of by the bump on the western edge there. And weed seeds and manure has been a topic that has kind of come up in the last couple of years as being kind of a hot topic, especially in Minnesota. You're going to hear me talk about this a little bit in the presentation. I won't try to dwell on it too much because it doesn't apply to all of you, but there's a new curse word in Minnesota, and it's called Palmer amaranth. And it is a weed that we are trying to eradicate, trying to keep out. Like, we don't even want one plant in a field. So that's been a challenge. And since manure has been identified as a vector of introducing this weed, I have been kind of dragged kicking and screaming into the weed science world. So that's my way of saying I'm not a weed scientist. So if we could not talk about mode of actions, that would be great. That's what Mike is here for. If you have weed biology, weed herbicide questions, that's for Mike. So, okay, let's dive into the manure world here. And first, let's talk about why we care about weed seeds and manure. Why is this even a concern? And one of the main reasons is that you end up with weedy fields, right? So contaminated manure contaminated with weed seeds, your seeds end up in the field, you end up with a weedy field, and you end up with yield loss. That's the end of the day, what people care about, right? Yield loss. That picture on the right there, believe it or not, is a soybean field. There's soybeans in there somewhere, I promise. And that weed right there is Palmer amaranth. This picture's not from Minnesota. Oh my gosh, we would curl up into a little ball if we saw that in Minnesota. But that's kind of the worst case scenario that you're looking at right there. So yield loss. Worst case scenario, you can expect up to 91% yield loss in corn, 79% in soybeans, if you've got a super weedy field. So how do weed seeds get into manure in the first place? So the mode of transport that we kind of always think about with manure is your feed is contaminated with weed seeds, and then it goes through animal digestion, gets fed to your animals, and it ends up in the manure, and then it gets spread on the field, and that's how it ends up there. But I want to point out that there are a couple other ways that seeds end up in manure or in your field, and that can be through spilled feed. Maybe you've got messy eaters that are spilling the feed over the edge of the trough. Bedding, that can be a big one. You know, that's the bedding brought in, and you know that never gets eaten, so the weed seeds in there don't go through digestion at all. And then weedy stockpiles, which I won't tell you where that stockpile is. It's totally not at my place of work. No, you look around, you see weedy stockpiles like that, you're going to end up with weed seeds dropping from those weeds that are growing in the stockpile. So these are just some ways that the seeds kind of circumnavigate the digestive system, and so they'll end up being more viable than if they had gone through animal digestion in the first place. So what can you do to minimize weed seeds in manure? First of all, don't assume that animal digestion is going to fix your problem, because it's probably not going to. Some people think that if you feed your animals the weed seeds, that it'll stop being a problem, that manure or that the animal digestion will kill all the weed seeds, everything will be hunky-dory, everything will be fine. That's not the case. So we're going to look at two categories of weed seeds. You've got the large, soft-coated grass weed seeds. These are easier to kill. So I'm talking about, like, you know, foxtail, kochia, barnyard grass, that sort of thing. In this study, they fed those seeds to ruminant animals. So in this case, they did dairy cattle, and poultry. In this case, they did turkeys, and looked at the amount viable remaining seeds. So for the ruminant digestion, that was 7% remaining viable. And for the turkey digestion, only 0.25% viable. Now, when I started off in the weed seed world, I thought that the ruminant digestion would do a better job of killing the weed seeds than the poultry. I'm no animal biologist, but I thought 4 stomachs is a lot of stomachs. That's got to do a good job of killing weed seeds. But it turns out the gizzard in the poultry system is more effective at killing the weed seeds. So these are for the large, soft-coated grass weed seeds. They're easier to kill by far than compared to the small hard-coated broadleaf weed seeds. All those seeds, anything from an amaranth species, they look like poppy seeds. They're teeny tiny. They are much harder to kill. And so same sort of thing, fed to ruminant and poultry. And you see a increase in viable seeds remaining. So 27% remain viable in the ruminant digestion and 3.5% viable in the turkey. So how do you manage weed seeds in, well, not necessarily in manure, but in your system? So we're going to look at kind of the front end feed and then the back end manure of weed seeds and how we can manage this problem. So heat is the enemy of seed survival. Heating it up is going to be your friend. So what we're looking for here is to hit at least 140 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 60 degrees Celsius for you maple syrup drinkers, for at least 3 days. Now, I don't mean 3 days in a row. You can, because I'm thinking about the composting process and you have kind of those peaks and valleys of temperature in that, but you want to hit at least 3 days of temperatures that are higher than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And how you get there is kind of up to you, kind of choose your own adventure. If you want to blowtorch your manure, I don't recommend that, but there are some ways you can introduce heat into your system to help reduce the viability of those weed seeds. So what works in siling the feed, you don't quite get as hot as composting with putting your corn in silage or whatever, but you do get some heat and it does help a little bit. I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Composting manure is kind of our gold standard for weed seed destruction in manure. We'll talk about that in a moment too. Let's also talk about what doesn't really work well, and that's anaerobic conditions. So if you've got deep manure pits with anaerobic conditions down in the depths or anaerobic digestion, there have been studies that show reduced viability of seed, but not a lot, not a significant amount, not compared especially to the systems that have oxygen in them with ensiling and composting and those sorts of things. Okay, so let's look at ensiling the feed first of all. So all of these going forward, we're just going to talk about the small seeded weed seeds. So those amaranth species, those ones that are harder to kill, because this is kind of a worst case scenario type thing. So just assume that everything that I show you from here on out, if it was a grass seed, it'd be much easier to kill. So what this study did, they looked at haylage and corn silage, and they ensiled the feed for 1 month. And then they looked at what the seed viability was after ensiling. Now they used red root pigweed for this, if I recall. So haylage ended up with 59% viability remaining, corn silage 40%. Knocked it down by half almost. That's pretty darn good. So then they decided to just double the time of ensiling. They just did corn silage for this one. Ensiled it for 2 months. Knocked it down to 13% viable seed remaining. That's pretty good, especially compared to, 40% at 1 month, doubling the time. Knock down your viability by another considerable amount. So the next thing they did was look at the corn silage and then fed to a ruminant animal, which is what you're going to do anyway. So they ensiled the corn silage for 2 months, and then they fed it to some dairy cattle, and then they looked at the post ensiling and digestion viability of the seed. And here they ended up with 11% viability remaining, which isn't that much better than, we had 13% with just ensiling for 2 months. So when you added the digestion and ended up in the manure, down a couple of points, down to 11%, but not leaps and bounds better than just ensiling. So now looking at the other end of the animal, at the manure end, manure composting is probably the best way to reduce weed seed viability in manure. So this study here looked at, once again, small seeded weed seeds, and they put it through the composting rigors, and usually they found about 2 to 10% viable seeds remaining. Now, if you look at studies with composting manure and weed seed viability reduction, you'll find studies that say they got down to 0% viability. We killed 100% of the seeds. But then if you look through the materials and methods in those studies, you'll see that those were in the lab. Those are lab conditions. Out in the real world, you're not going to find such controlled conditions. And it's important to do that lab work too, to proof of concept. But when you put it out in the field, the actual field composting studies, they never get down to 0% viability. And that's because manure is a non-uniform product. We all know that. And there's always going to be cooler pockets. There's always going to be escapes when you've got tiny seeds and a bunch of manure. So, 2% viability is probably the best you can kind of hope for if you're doing proper composting. And the important word here is proper and proper composting, because I'm going to get this tattooed on my forehead, I swear. Aged manure is not composted manure. I'll say it again. Aged manure is not composted manure. So many people tell me like, oh yeah, I compost my manure. And then it's a weedy, stagnant pile that's been sitting out behind the barn for 3 years or something like that. And it hasn't been turned. It hasn't been managed. It hasn't been, moisture hasn't been assessed, none of that. So proper composting requires active management. And for a good seed mortality, you got to do it for at least a month. More, 2 months plus is preferable. And the two things that are important there, I could have a whole nother spiel on just composting manure, but the two things that are really important for composting manure for weed seed mortality is heat and moisture. So your optimal temperature is about 160 degrees. I remember I said 3 was the minimum, so 4+ days here would be optimal. That's the dream. My compost seems to sit around 150 degrees before it gets too hot. I don't like it to get up to 160, but then I have a nitrogen problem. I have too much nitrogen. So that's my problem, and it starts getting ashy. But, you definitely don't want to get up above 180 degrees. You're going to start killing those microbes in your composting system, and it's going to go downhill real fast. And then the minimum temperature that I mentioned before was 140 to get good weed seed mortality. But what's also important is the moisture content of the compost. You can't just have it hot. If it's super dry, it's not going to work. So our optimal moisture content is 50%. It can be anywhere from 35 to 80%. And if it's lower than 35%, if it's really dry, even if you've got the right temperatures in there, somehow it's not going to do a good job killing the weed seeds. You need to have at least 35% moisture. And you don't have to be out there with like a soil tensiometer or anything trying to get the exact moisture content of your compost. You can just do that squeeze test where you just take a handful of your compost, squeeze it, and it should kind of form a nice little ball in your hand, but it shouldn't be dripping water and it shouldn't crumble up and blow away in the wind. So warm and moist are the important things for composting manure. Okay, now we're going to do some daunting math. I'm not going to make you do math. I'm just going to tell you what the math is. So 98% reduction in viability seems great, right? That's fantastic. You've got 2% viability remaining. That's great. Well, it's not necessarily great if you've got eradication as your goal, as we do in Minnesota with Palmer amaranth. So we're going to do some daunting math here. So imagine you've got 70 Palmer amaranth seeds. Those are the tiny seeds that look like poppy seeds, remember? You've got 70 of them in 1 ton of manure. So a ton of manure with only 70 seeds. The picture on the right there is 70 seeds on the head of a dime. You know how small a dime is? I looked it up. The Canadian dime is the same size. little different look to it, but same size. So that's 70 seeds right there. So if you spread them out throughout a ton of manure, and you did everything right, and you got down to just 2% survival, 2% viability, that's about a seed and a half per ton. That's really good. That's fantastic. Well, now let's say you apply that at 8 tons per acre. You end up with 11 seeds per acre. That's also not so bad. But then when you apply to, a 40-acre section, you end up with 440 viable seeds. For many seeds, that's not a huge deal. For Palmer amaranth in Minnesota, that is a big deal. We don't want one plant in a field. So 440 viable seeds out there is not great. And then the last piece of advice that I have for dealing with weed seeds in manure is spread the manure on the land and then scout often. This graph is kind of a chart of weed emergence and flowering compared to our crop planting and harvesting times. This is for Minnesota. Let's keep that in mind. Everywhere else is different. But you can see that our weeds here on the bottom, our crops here are up here in yellow. And you've got the green ones are the emergence period for each of our major problematic weeds. And then the flowering period here is in red. And you can see that we don't have Palmer amaranth on this table. And here's why it's a problem. Palmer amaranth has such a wide emergence period. You know, if you scout mid-June, you're like, I don't have any, I'm good. You could have stuff emerging still out in August. So that's a specific challenge that we have. And so scout early, scout often to determine what your weed seed issues are, and then you can respond as quickly as possible. And that is the end of my spiel. And I think we're going to jump right into Dr. Steph. So I'm going to stop sharing here and she can take over and we'll move along.
Awesome. Well, yeah, that seeing those 70 seeds on a dime gets me every time, because I've looked at these seeds through a microscope and it blows my mind every time how small they actually are when I take them out from under a microscope. So my name's Stephanie Kaleza. I'm at NC State University in the Crop and Soil Sciences department. I also focus mostly on fertility. But the reason why I got into this is we have a lot of poultry litter in North Carolina because we have a very large broiler industry. And so in using that for fertilizer, I often get comments about, you know, whether weeds have come to a field from an application 3 years ago, or people hesitant to utilize manure because of the potential for weed seed contamination. And up until a couple years ago, you know, my main, response was, look, there's probably there are a lot more seeds in your soil seed bank, and it's likely a response to that. But I ended up in, actually doing some research in this field because I came across what a lot of you likely have, which is I was trying to do some research and I got a lot of weeds that came up in a field. And so I started questioning, I was like, is it in the manure? And so that really started me on a path of taking a look at not only whether weed seeds are in manure, but also how the manure itself affects the viability and germination of weed seeds. And so this is something that we've dug into a little bit over the past few years. So I'm going to give you a couple insights and some info on what we found here in North Carolina. So in that situation, I had those, weeds coming up, and I decided I'm going to take it back to the lab and see where the weed seeds are coming from. And so the first thing I did is I collected soil from the field, and then I also got a sterilized sand. And then I added either the litter, or I, didn't add litter or anything else on top of the soil. Another treatment I had within that is I autoclaved half of the soils as well. And if you don't know what an autoclave is, it basically, it's a chamber that is pressurized, and you have high temperature and you have steam and that pressure. And so it sterilizes things, and it's used in the biomedical industry and in the science field to make sure things are sterile. And so we sterilized half the soil to see, all right, is it coming from the poultry litter, or is it coming from the soil? And really what we found is on the left, we have the soils and the sand that were not autoclaved, with and without litter. And then on the right, we have our autoclaved soils and sand. And what you can really see is those seeds were coming from the soil itself. And so in this one instance with this one litter, I was very confident in the fact that the weed seeds that were coming up were a result of the soil seed bank itself. But I wanted to dive into this a little further. And so In North Carolina, we're really lucky to have a bunch of a very robust extension network. And so we have a lot of agents that we can work with. So I asked some of our agents who specialize in poultry to get me a bunch of random litter samples. And so they went and they collected samples from all over the state. And we got 61 individual litters that were submitted for this study. And so what we were thinking is, all right, we'll just see if anything germinates from the poultry litter. But actually, when we try to just add water to poultry litter, nothing would germinate because it's such a salty solution that it actually will not allow seeds to germinate and continue to grow. And so we actually had to dilute it with potting media to even see if anything would germinate out of it. So we had two sets of controls. We had controls where we had just potting media alone to make sure that we didn't have any seeds in the potting media source. And then we had controls where we mixed a litter and then seeded those to make sure that the environment was such that seeds could actually germinate in that environment. And then we seeded those with either mustard, wheat, or sickle pod to give us a variety of seed sizes and coatings. And then we put those in a germination chamber for 21 days. And this is what that setup looked like. So we weighed out our poultry litters, we put them onto or into our Petri dishes with potting media, and then we put those into an incubation chamber. What we found is it did not have an inhibitory effect. Our poultry litter did not inhibit growth. So that means that our dilution factor was correct. We needed to dilute it to have good germination, and we saw really good germination out of our controls. What we found is one germinable weed seed germinated out of those 61 litters, and it was a grass seed. And then we saw some differences between our spiked seeds. So wheat had a higher germination than mustard or sickle pod. So woohoo, let's go spread litter everywhere, right? We only had one seed come out of those 61 litters, but we wanted to dig into this a little further. So let's take a look at how we dug even further into this issue. So we selected 15 of those litters to do a bit of a deeper dive. And when I say a bit of a deeper dive, I mean a lot of time spent looking through a microscope for weed seeds. We took 20 grams of each of those litters, and we did that 3 different times, and sieved it through 3 different sieve sizes. And so we washed it through those sieves to make sure that we were able to find the weed seeds of those different sizes. And then we dried those and counted the seeds and removed them using a dissecting microscope. And then we tested the viability of those seeds using an imbibed crush test. And this is where you put the seeds in water for 24 hours. And then if you apply pressure and you resistance, that means that that is still a viable seed. Now, if the seed coating is cracked, or you see mold or anything like that, or it's mushy, that means that it's not a viable seed. And so that's how we tested the viability. And so looking at that, we saw a very different story as compared to our initial germination test. And what we found is, unfortunately, which we talked about in the last presentation, amaranth was present in a lot of our samples. And so we found 12 of the 15 litters had some sort of seed present, and 6 of those contained viable weed seeds. And the viable weed seeds ranged from 15,000 to 45,000 seeds per ton. And so that's quite a few seeds. That's a lot more than 70 seeds per ton of litter, or per ton of dairy manure we were talking about earlier. And so the average viable seed content was 10,090 seeds per ton. And of the, and that's viable. So 18.5% of the seeds that we found were viable. And so these calculations are based on the number of viable seeds that were in the litter. And unfortunately, amaranth again was the most common seed found and had a 16% viability. Now, I'm also going to walk you through some math to talk about what this means. And so I want to talk about 1, what a common application rate for poultry litter is, and 2, what are we seeing in the existing soil seed bank? So one, you know, if we're applying 140 to 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre for corn, we're probably going to apply in the range of 5 tons per acre as an application rate. And so that would add 50,000 seeds per acre at our average 10,090 viable seeds per ton. And so that equates to 1.2 seeds per square foot. And that definitely sounds like a lot. But when we look at what's in the existing seed bank, we see that this is a very small amount in comparison to what is in the existing soil seed bank. And so even at the worst case scenario down here in Roberts, 1970, with 372 seeds per square foot, you know, we're talking about less than 0.5% of the existing soil seed bank. So increasing the existing soil seed bank by less than 0.5%. But that's still not nothing. And so we know that, especially in areas where you're trying to eradicate, 10,000 seeds per ton is a crazy high number. In North Carolina, unfortunately, we do have widespread Palmer amaranth infestation. And so while I was very surprised to find this, I can definitely understand, you know, that there's a lot of amaranth seed in the environment down here in North Carolina. And so it's something that I was getting questions about, and this is what we found when we did these studies. And so some next steps are to determine the source of these contaminations. And so we want to look at, is it coming from the feed? Is it happening during storage? Is it due to bedding materials, species dependent? You know, are there any differences that we see? We have not only broiler production, but we also have turkey production in North Carolina. We have a little bit of egg production. So there's an opportunity to look at all these different types of manures and see whether we see a difference and how we might learn from the other parts of the broiler or poultry community to try to figure out how to best protect our litters from weed seed contamination. And then also there's treatment and handling. So we heard that composting can be a very effective means of reducing weed seeds, but we lose a lot of our nitrogen. And honestly, poultry litter, the majority of its value comes from its high nitrogen content. And composting isn't really a viable option for a lot of people who are using or generating poultry litter. And so we want to see what are some options that we can utilize to try to reduce weed seed in poultry litters. So as a conclusion, we did find weed seeds in poultry litter. However, the amount, while it sounds like a high number, is a small percentage as compared to the existing seed bank. We've also done some work looking at, you know, remember I said we couldn't get weed seeds to germinate out of 100% poultry litter, and that's because there's a salt effect there. So just because there's 10,000 viable seeds per ton doesn't mean that all of those are going to germinate. And it doesn't mean that, you know, that will 100% cause an infestation in your field, but it is something to consider and keep an eye on for anyone who's using poultry litter in North Carolina. And so that's why we're trying to spread this information and provide it to growers in North Carolina, because we do have a lot of amaranth going around.
Awesome. Thank you both for your presentation. Okay, we've got lots of time for questions here, and there have been some come in. I will say right off the bat, you know, imagining you counting seeds in manure brings back a story I just have to tell. You know, when I was 13 years old, my dad sent me to work for another farmer, which was a typical thing to do. And I show up on day one, and the farmer hands me a fork, and he said, "I have a very special ring that I wear on my fingers, which I lost when I was delivering a calf in this manure pen." He said, "Your job today is to sort through the manure and find that ring." And so I spent 4 hours taking little forkfuls and weaving through it until I heard a clank, and I did find it, but it gave me an image of, having to actually break this down. And so it was interesting hearing some of the process you went through there to take it to the point and seeing what seeds are viable. Interesting stuff. Mike, I just wonder if you got any comments right off the bat here before we jump in further.
I have questions, so
Go for it.
I'm going to go for it. Yeah. So what's comforting in both of your presentations is if you look at the literature that's already been done, and just even my own kind of personal experience trying to kill weed seeds. I guess the comforting thing is the story is very much the same in terms of if we hit a certain temperature range, and as Dr. Moderman indicated, combine that with moisture, which is pretty critical. If we hit that range, it's pretty effective at killing weed seeds, like at least the majority of it. Like, it's, as you acknowledge, pretty tough to get to 100%. But I guess, like, when I think about this issue, and apologies to people in the audience, because this isn't my wheelhouse, the manure side of it, it seems to me that killing weed seeds in manure is almost akin to preparing meat, right? Like, you can either go, quick with high heat on the barbecue, or you can go low and slow in a cooker, right? Like, and seems to me, I guess my first question to both of you is if we have a storage facility where we're piling manure, and maybe it's not going to be composted, what are some things that you could do to get it up to that 140 Fahrenheit, 60 degrees Celsius temperature kind of uniformly throughout a pile, like to make incremental gains, I guess, in terms of reducing the viability of what weeds you have? Like, I mean, the compost would be where we want to be, but like, where can we make some small incremental gains in our manure storage system to kill weed seeds, I guess, is my question.
Well, first of all, I love that analogy. I think I'm going to use the analogy of killing weed seeds and cooking meat. I'm going to use that in future presentations. I like that. So stockpiling manure in any capacity, even if you're not planning to compost it, you're going to get a temperature spike right away, right? As soon as you pile it, it starts heating up, and then eventually it'll peak and kind of stagnate and cool off. And that's, in the composting world, that's right when we go in and turn it, and then that heats it back up. So if you're not doing the turning aspect of it, you're still going to get that temperature hike at least once to probably above 140, unless you're very carbon heavy, then you might not hit that. But with most manures and bedding systems, if you're not horribly over bedding, you're probably going to hit that at least once, and that's better than nothing. I do kind of poo-poo aged manure, just stockpiling and leaving it there, but it's better than nothing. It's better than the daily scrape and haul operations that are probably going to have more weed seeds than just stockpiling and kind of leaving it there. As long as you go through and maybe pull any weeds that try to grow out of the stockpile that's sitting there, because otherwise that's just going to generate more weed seeds.
And I'll add on to that I think, you talk about storage and how we can reduce weed seed. And one thing I would emphasize is making sure that you maintain vegetation around those areas. And so it's one thing if you're talking about a completely enclosed building, but if you're talking about something where, weed seeds can be dispersed and end up in the manure, then it could end up being a source of contamination if you don't maintain the vegetation around those facilities. And anecdotally, we've heard that, either through the curtains being down on the sides of poultry housing to allow for ventilation, or stockpiling right next to a weedy area, those are obvious ways that we can have additional contamination, is through those sources not being controlled around the storage facility itself.
Have either of you had any experience, like largely the focus has been on weed seeds, but have you noticed anecdotally, because I don't imagine it was a focus of either trial, but have you looked at other propagative material like rhizomes or tubers or anything of that nature? Does the same rules apply, or didn't look at it, don't know? interesting, but have no idea.
I have no idea.
Okay,
I also have no idea.
fair enough. Like, yeah, I mean, the Amarantha species, they seem to be the most pernicious in terms of trying to kill them. Seems like they need a lot of heat, well, heat over a prolonged period of time. Like you did discuss this in your first answer, Dr. Moderman, but are there things that we can do to sustain that heat over a longer period of time? Like what are some best practices around there? Again, this is me just coming from a place of not knowing, of being ignorant.
Sustaining the higher temperatures can be a challenge, and if it's in composting, especially, you're going to have, you know, a temperature rise and then a dip. But remixing the compost, adding that oxygen from the atmosphere back into it and making sure you have the right moisture content is going to hike that temp right back up there. And so if you're really diligent on there, if you're because I have nothing better to do, I temp my compost every single day in the summertime, you know, go out there, and everyone's got to have hobbies, right? Sticking a temperature probe into a pile of poop is mine. And you can catch that temperature dip real quick, and then if you mix it right back up, you're going to sustain higher temperatures. And that's kind of the higher, woo, go Steph with your temperature probe there sitting in the background. You're going to do, you know, back to your meat analogy, that's going to be kind of the quicker, faster route of the higher heat for longer periods of time. But that's not necessarily better than letting the temp cycle down and up, and taking a little bit longer. There's pros and cons to each, depending on what facilities you have, how much time you have.
Just curious, Dr. Steph, do like disposable probes exist that you could just like embed in manure piles, compost piles, track it on your phone in terms of temperatures? Does that kind of stuff exist? Because I would assume that'd be very valuable in terms of kind of knowing what's going on.
I don't know that there's any disposables,
Right.
but there are data logging thermometers on the market. And so that is an option. The most, you know, the cheapest route is likely just getting a thermometer and checking it periodically. So this is a 3-foot composting thermometer that we have. A lot of our extension agents have them, and we loan them out to producers if they're doing compost work on their facilities, just to make sure they're hitting the target temps. And so, you know, I do recommend just getting a thermometer. That way it's easy. You can have it in the truck. I wouldn't recommend having it in the bed of the truck rolling around, because they are that's plastic, but it's not super heavy duty. But these, you know, they're easy to carry around and easy to have in the backseat of the truck. So that's what I use. Chrysius, you know, do you have a data logging thermometer?
No, that's above my pay grade. I get to go out there every day, and it's storing them in a PVC pipe. That's a good idea. I have them in the big cardboard tube that they come in. That takes up too much room. I'm going to switch to the little PVC pipe storage, because the tips are super sensitive on them too, and I don't want to break that or harm it. And it's a good idea.
My last question, and then I'll give it back to Andrew. I assume this is way more challenging to do in liquid manure, where it's very difficult. It's not like you can, unless you can like magically heat up a vat of liquid manure to the desired temperature. I assume this is more challenging. But so then maybe the methodology is physical destruction of seeds. I guess, are you aware of, like, to me on the intake pump or the agitator pump, that would be maybe a spot where you could start crushing seeds or physically destroying them, as opposed to, I guess my question that I'm finally getting to it is, can you achieve the same sort of kill in a liquid manure system, or are you going to have to look, like with heat and moisture, you're going to have to look elsewhere for ways to destroy? That's my question.
Yeah, liquid systems are tough. My presentation talks a lot about the composting. You can't compost the liquid manure. You're probably not going to get a big cauldron and heat it up that way. And I also mentioned that the anaerobic conditions that are in deep pits, some people will think that's going to help, but the results are negligible on weed seed kill for that. So what I tell people, we had one farmer who in his liquid system had a real bad weed seed problem, not just Palmer, but just so many weed seeds, and his livelihood, one of his biggest incomes was selling that manure to others, and they don't want it if it's got a bunch of weed seeds in it. So he came to us and we worked on some solutions with him, and he ended up investing in a solid liquid separating system because he was kind of on the fence about going that direction anyway, and so it kind of pushed him right over the edge into wanting to do that. And then he found that most of those weed seeds end up in the solid portion when you do solid liquid separation. I'm sure there's studies on that. I don't have the data, but anecdotally, his worked out with whatever system he invested in, and then composted that solid portion before spreading it. Otherwise, liquid application, yeah, is a challenge. I recommend, if you're not going to do the liquid solid thing, scout your fields, apply your highly contaminated with seeds, that manure to fields that are nearby that you're going to see often, that you're going to walk often, and scout them.
So there have been a number of questions come in, some direct message to me in the chat. First, I'll mention some comments you can see there from Chris Duke. Chris is a colleague of ours here in Ontario, and he lives and breathes digesters. So he's got to stand up for them, which is what he's done here in the chat. So you can see his comment there, 2004 Minnesota study showing, and you referred to this in terms of poor results from the digestion process in terms of limiting the seeds and the viability. His comment just that, hey, if there's a longer retention time, then possibly that could show a better kill rate. You know, a thermophilic digester with a good retention time, we might see different results. Any comments on the anaerobic digestion side, or do you think these numbers are probably the ones that you're referring to from 2004?
Yeah, I'm guessing that's the exact study that I am referring to. And even that study didn't show no killing of weed seeds. It was just not great. And so, yeah, increasing the time probably would increase the kill rates.
Well, Chris, there's a good research project for you to take on in the future here. We had a question that came from a farmer he's a poultry farmer, and he is in Wisconsin. And he's wondering about, you made comments about the saltiness of the manure. And so he's wondering about, is all poultry manure salty regardless of region in the US? And what is the effect of salty poultry manure on weed seed viability? And maybe Dr. Steph, that's for you.
Yeah, so all poultry litters are going to have a lot of salts, and so they will have high salts no matter what region you come from. It has to do with the uric acid that's excreted by the poultry itself, and so all of those will be salty. And so when it comes to viability and successfulness of weed seeds, we've done some lab studies, which you've already heard that they can't 100% be related to real world, but we've done some lab studies to look at germination and viability of weed seeds. And so when we applied weeds to a soil, and so we spiked a soil with seeds, and then we applied poultry litter on top, we saw reduced germination of 3 different weed species with different size coatings and different types of seeds. And so there is that effect of that salt effect of reducing the germination itself, because it's a hostile environment for those seeds. We've also done some studies looking at the leachates from poultry litter and seeing how that affects the growth response of different weed species. And what we saw is that with the high salt content, it can damage the radicle, which is the tip of the root as it's germinating, and it can reduce the viability of weed seeds. And so that is going to play a role when you move to the field scale, talk about the number of viable seeds that are in the poultry litter versus what actually germinates. We don't have the data, though, to really talk about, all right, there's this many seeds, and due to the environmental, situation that these seeds are going to encounter, this is how many are going to germinate in the field. That's a really tough question to answer because there's a lot of environmental controllers. It's going to be temperature, moisture, soil type, all these things are going to impact how many of those seeds survive in that environment that they're applied to. And so it's difficult to pinpoint it, but yes, all poultry litters are salty, and that's going to play a role and likely reduce germination, but we just don't know how much.
Perfect, thank you. So Nick is wondering about the effect of tillage systems. Okay, so minimum till versus plowing, or even just leaving the manure on the surface. How does that play into all of this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. That's a complicating factor. So tillage is going to distribute those seeds within the seed profile, and so a certain percentage of those are not going to be able to germinate that are actually in the manure itself. But if you think about my presentation, I talked about how that's a small percentage of the actual seed bank that is existing in the soil. And so there's kind of this confounding factor of you're burying some seeds, but you're also exposing others that have been buried. And so that tillage effect can be both of those things. It can, one, bury existing seeds that are at the surface that could germinate, but it could also expose new seeds. And so again, very complicated, really to parse out what's from the poultry litter and what's from the soil seed bank itself. That would be a whole nother study to see what the percentage of each and what the trade-offs would be there.
The other question that came in that relates to that is timing of manure application. So in the spring, in the fall, the summer, how does that factor in?
Ooh, that's you're throwing them all at me. And in North Carolina, a lot of our manure is going on in the spring.
Okay.
Just because we grow a lot of summer crops, or our highest value crops are going to be in the summer. And so I think that it's really going to be dependent on, I'm trying to think of the climate in Canada, and I think Chrysias might have a better she's more north than I am, because we could have weed seeds germinate all year around here. Versus that winter effect. So maybe she'll chime in here.
I don't think it is going to matter all that much if you apply in the fall versus spring in terms of weed seed germination and that sort of thing. We've got our real cold temperatures here, and any seeds that need that cold temperature to germinate are going to get that throughout the fall, whereas they wouldn't get that in the spring. But then you're going to end up getting that at some point anyway. So when they emerge, if that really matters to you, applying in the spring is probably going to get you less weed seeds than fall, but it's all going to come to a head at some point anyway.
So
Hey, Andrew,
Christine,
I just wanted to
Mike.
jump on that tillage question, because my speculation is that even though you're not killing 100% of, like, I'm just going to focus on pigweed for a second, not killing 100% of the seed. My guess is with those temperature and moisture that you might actually be breaking dormancy of a higher percentage than normally. Like, one of the things we do in the lab to break dormancy of pigweed seed is we put sulfuric acid on it and then sprinkle water to heat it up and break dormancy. So then from a tillage perspective, in theory, conventional wisdom is you try and leave all that seed on closer to the surface, because if it has broken dormancy, it'll germinate. It's in theory easier to kill, or more prone to like being eaten by insects and other predatory creatures, right? So if it's going to go through a composting system, probably better to leave it closer to the surface where it's going to germinate and you can kill it, as opposed to burying it. But that would be my 2 cents on that.
Awesome. Just catching up on the chat questions. So somebody is asking about, in terms of the composting process that you mentioned, Chrissy's, the temperature goal, 140 degrees Fahrenheit minimum for compost. You mentioned 160 degrees is where you really begin killing off microbes when you get higher than that. this question is asking what's the effect of 140 degrees on the microbes?
Well, as long as you're not if you're not too hot to kill the microbes are happy. Microbes are very happy at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. If it gets lower than that, if you start getting too cold, they're not going to die. They're just going to kind of go dormant. Start killing them when you get too hot. So you don't want to be too hot. You can be too cold. And even if you get too cold, your pile's not dead. You can revive it. You can mix it up again, get the moisture right, and it'll start heating up for you again. 140 degrees is where they're pretty happy. 150, 140, something like that.
Perfect. And here's a couple kind of field crop related. So Mike, feel free to jump in here. One is in terms of general weed control in crop fields, more specifically weeds which are resistant to glyphosate and maybe other herbicides. Are we look at farmers needing to look at controlling these weeds with the use of cover crops?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, but I guess more specific to some of the items that Dr. Steph touched on is just like there's multiple paths to contaminating a manure source. You know, there's multiple paths for weed seed spread. So yeah, I think cover crops are an element, and that's going to be more on stopping recruitment of certain species. But we're going to ultimately need there's seed destructors on the back of combines to kill seed that passes through. So before it hits the ground. And then, yeah, I think, biosecurity, quite frankly, will be a fairly big component. If we can't rely on herbicides, it'll be other modes of action, but prevention in the first place will be critical. Not easy, right? But a critical component. Yeah.
So Pat Lynch, one of our agronomists here in Ontario, is asking about the economics, particularly, Chrissy's, when you talk about composting. And so thinking, you mentioned about the loss of nitrogen there, and that's certainly a factor for people versus the benefit of weed seeds killed. And any comments on that, on the economics? Have you included that in any of your work?
Yeah, everything we do in agriculture is risk management, right? Everything's a balancing act. You're gonna lose some of your total nitrogen through the composting process, depending on what kind of animal species you have. But the benefits might outweigh that if you have a weed seed problem, if you're concerned about that. If it's not worth your time and effort, then you don't have to do it. Scout your fields, do a traditional weed management program. It's whatever works for you on a case-by-case basis.
Right on. There's a few more questions, but I think we're at the end of our time here. So we did maybe call on if you could pull up that poll question right now for us. There's just some quick questions here we wanted to ask for our presenters. We're requesting just to be able to get some feedback on the work they're doing and where to go from here. So there's 3 questions there. If you could go ahead and answer those. I think the poll is live right now. So you should be able to begin answering those. Managing weed seeds and manure is important in my operation. Agree, disagree, whatever. Yeah, 3 questions there. If you could just work through that as we're finishing up. And maybe while you're doing that, I'll just pull one last question here. And Chrissy's, maybe this is for you, because in Ontario, we have a number of dairy farms that have moved to composting bedded packs. And I don't know how common that is in your area, but where the pack is in the barn and part of the bedding system. Any thoughts on, is that going to reduce the viable weed seeds in those systems?
Everything that's old is new again, right? The compost barns are something that, when I first started getting into the manure world, seemed like a thing of the past, and now they're back. Oh, wow. At least around here. And they're just coming back into vogue in Minnesota these days. Canada is apparently ahead of the curve. Or behind the curve, depending on how you look at it. But yeah, it's not as a controlled form as as composting a stockpile that's in, one of the typical 3-to-1 ratio triangle piles that you can manage and test the moisture and stick your temperature probe in. And because you got animals on it, so it's probably going to help to some degree, but not as much as a traditional compost pile. How much is going to reduce viability? I don't know. Maybe there's studies from 30 years ago that looked at that. I haven't seen those.
Right on. Well, listen, I'm going to pull up the QR code for those who are CCAs, and let's just get that up here. Okay, you can click on that. If that does not work for you, then feel free to put your name and CEU number in the, or CCA number in the chat, and we will take care of that for you. But we will see you next week. No, we will not see you next week. Next week in Ontario is Family Day, so we're taking that week off. That'd be a good time for you to go and check out the recorded sessions already. And then we'll be back again the following Monday. But thank you very much to our 3 presenters on the panel this morning. We appreciate the discussion, lots of good interaction and good things to think about. So thank you very much. And I trust everybody will have a good week, and we'll see you 2 weeks today. Cheers.